the Leah Andrews Show. I am so happy to have with us Rachel Singletary, the Worm Lady of Fort Myers. And she's going to show us today a little bit about how you can incorporate using worms and worm castings into improving your soil. So welcome, Rachel. It's so happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
If you can tell
Glad
me,
to be here.
how did you get involved with worms? That's kind of an interesting thing for a woman to get involved with, I guess.
At first I had a local bait dealer who needed a new worm producer. So I started raising worms for bait, and then I found out about the value of worm castings in using in the garden and for environmentalists. So I stopped selling bait worms, and now I give classes to homeowners, gardeners, schools on how to raise their own worms and worm castings so that they can use the worm castings in their garden. And it's considered organic, and the schools are not allowed to use pesticides or commercial fertilizers, but worm castings are safe. So.
And you were telling me here in Southwest Florida, around a lot of our properties is this really sandy, not nutritious soil.
So you want to, number one, use a lot of mulch. Forget the rocks, forget the manicured lava, white rocks, any kind of stone. Don't put your grass clippings out at the curb or your leaves if you're lucky enough to have a tree that produces leaves. Rake all of that up and make sure you keep it in your flower beds and give the native worms a place to survive in your own yard. We do have native worms in Florida. People don't believe it, but that's because they never see them, because the poor worms don't have anything to eat if you're not giving them a lot of shade and a lot of food to eat. So we do have native worms, but you can also use non-native composting worms to make your own worm castings. And that is what we have here.
Okay.
So my motto is, I've got worms, you need them too. And I live in North Fort Myers on 10 acres. And you're inside of our worm bin house. And the name of our business is Pine Forest Fruit and Flower Farm, because we do grow a lot of fruit trees and lots of butterfly plants with flowers for bees as well as butterflies and birds. So you're here to learn about composting with worms. So one thing you can do, you can just listen to this simple video and learn everything you need to know, or if you're more of a scientist and you want to know more of the scientific basis behind using worms, you can read this book, Teeming with Microbes, and it will explain to you all about the soil web world. We all should have that soil web world in our yard, but because we have fill from construction and sand that's natural in Florida, we typically do not have good soil. So in addition to using the mulch and the grass clippings, you want to use some other form of humic acid, and worm castings are full of humus. Now this is a bag of worm castings. It's in a ventilated bag, and inside is a cereal bag that has just one staple in it, because you want these worm castings to stay alive. They are full of literally billions of microorganisms, and that means amoeba, fungus, nematodes, and not bad nematodes, good nematodes, mushrooms, billions and billions of organisms inside this one little bag. Now you only need about a tablespoon for a tomato plant, or bell pepper, whatever you're growing. So even though this is a small bag, it will go a very long way. You're not buying a 40-pound bag of commercial fertilizer full of fillers. You are buying strictly worm castings, which is worm poop, but it has been eaten by the worms hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's full of all these good bacteria.
Okay. So I have a question. So would you supplement with other kinds of fertilizer, or is this all you need with mulch for your plants?
I would just use this. Either this, or if you're going to use commercial fertilizer, don't mix it with the castings.
Don't mix it, okay.
Because the commercial fertilizer is so full of salts that it's going to kill a lot of these organisms. So you don't want to mix and match
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to end up wasting some of your castings.
Okay, and I just
Okay.
want to backtrack a little bit of why this is so important. In Chinese medicine, we have this concept of Jing, which is our vitality, our essence. And if we're not eating, it doesn't matter how we eat, if we're not eating food that's produced on soil that has nutrients and it's alive, then we're not going to be healthy. We're not going to get any of that vital energy from these plants because they don't have it to give.
True.
So this is the foundation of what all of us need to be doing, even if we are just backyard gardeners or on a commercial scale.
Absolutely. And the beauty of composting with worms is that you already have everything you need to feed them in your kitchen.
Oh, wow.
You're not going to throw away your food scraps. One of the worms' favorite food is melons. This is a little, it wasn't ripe enough.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, I would just feed them the rind. Here is an overripe papaya. There's coffee grounds with the paper. Anything that ever used to be wood,
Mm-hmm.
the worms can eat.
Mm.
Here's an overripe black sapote.
Mm-hmm.
So don't be afraid of feeding them overripe food.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a crisper and you've gone on vacation and you've got moldy squash or lettuce that's turned to mush, you can feed that to the worms.
Oh, wow.
They're not going to be the least bit.
They're not picky eaters.
No, not at all. Eggshells are wonderful.
Mm.
Everything except meat, fat, and dairy
Okay.
is what you're going to feed your worms. And you do not have to grind it up in a blender.
Ooh.
Now, if you do grind it up in a blender, obviously the worms are going to be able to eat it faster because worms don't have teeth.
Mm-hmm.
But they do have a gizzard,
Mm-hmm.
and they do have other organisms in the worm bin that break the food down for them first.
Okay.
Okay? So this is the recycled filing cabinets, and on top is window screen. And you do not have to have that on your worm bin, but the reason I do is because of soldier flies.
Okay.
Soldier flies are large flies. They don't bite, but they do lay eggs in your compost pile, whether it's a regular outside compost pile or whether it's a worm bin. Now those are not harmful, but they do compete with the food supply in the worm bin. A lot of people raise soldier fly larvae in their worm bin intentionally to feed to their chickens. So they're not bad,
Okay.
but they do become very, very highly populated.
Okay.
So I use the screen. Now this is the cover to your worm bin. You want your worm bin to be dark because worms like darkness, okay? So you keep it covered, that way it's dark, that way the worms can come up to the surface and eat. Inside this worm bin, we have lots of undigested food that you can see.
Oh, look at all these worms. Look
But
at this. It's amazing.
This proves how happy these worms are to eat leftover coleslaw.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? And I said no meat, no fat, no dairy.
Uh-huh.
But if you have a little bit of fat,
Mhm.
such as salad dressing, and this was a little bit of sugar and vinegar in this particular coleslaw.
Oh, they liked it.
But they love it. And you can see that I also have citrus. A lot of the internet sites will tell you no citrus. I use some because my worm bins are big.
Okay.
Okay?
And now I see these other little creepy crawlies in here.
You see, and I'm going to show you some, you're going to see earwigs, okay? And these do not bite. These are also decomposers. So what you want to remember is that you have other critters in the worm bin that eat the food source first. Here's a good example of them eating your cardboard top.
Oh.
So once they start eating the cardboard, you just mow it under.
Okay.
You also have beetles. You don't want roaches and you don't want ants, okay? But you do have lots and lots of pill bugs. Let me see. And people know pill bugs by different names. Sow bugs, roly-polies, and these are beetles. And they're not roaches. People think they're roaches. But you can see here how many worms there are around the cantaloupe.
Yeah.
And there's a beetle. You can use gloves, of course, and I use gloves if I'm not using my garden trowel. You don't want to use a garden shovel or a garden spade, but a garden trowel you can use to dig in your worm bin, and you're not going to hurt the worms.
Okay.
Okay? So this worm bin obviously has plenty of food in it. But
how often do you want to feed? How much food do you want available for your worms?
worms eat 1/2 their body weight every day. So if you consider that, you've got larger worms, and then you've got little tiny baby worms. So what you want to do, this is more of a teenager.
Okay.
You have some that are the size of a piece of thread.
Okay.
So what you want to do is bury the food. You don't want to just put it on top of the bin.
Okay.
If you do that, you're going to attract roaches and ants.
Yes.
So you want to bury the kitchen scraps. And you want to come back in 24 hours. And if the wet, soft food is gone, then you feed them again. So there's plenty of soft food left in here, so I won't feed them today.
Okay, so you want it to look like this when you come in, like to have some non-eaten food hanging
Yes. If it's hard food, like if you put a broccoli stalk in, that is not going to be eaten for several days or maybe a week, depending on how many worms you have in your bin. You want your worm bin to be crowded because you want the worms to be able to find each other so that they can mate.
Oh, they have to hang out.
They are both male and female.
Uh-huh.
And here is a band around near the head section, which they don't really have a head, but they do have brain cells, so we call this the head. And as they crawl, you can see this band. It's called a clitellum, and even though a worm is both male and female, they need another worm to mate with.
Oh.
So when you find two worms tied together in a knot, they are mating.
Oh, wow.
So I tell people to close the worm bin up, turn on some berry white,
Yes.
and light a candle, and let the worms have their privacy. And they will each lay what looks like a chicken egg. And they back away from the knot. They each lay a chicken egg, but it's the size of a tip of a pencil.
Okay.
And they're amber in color. Typically, you will have most of the eggs in the fall and winter and springtime. They tolerate heat very well. These are African night crawlers.
Okay.
And they have no problem with our heat in
great.
Florida.
So you want actually different breeds of worms depending on where you live in the country?
Yes. And you know, a lot of people want red wigglers, which I started out raising red wigglers for bait.
Yes.
And you can use red wigglers for composting, but the African night crawlers are bigger, and therefore they eat more, therefore they make more castings, and your worm bins will be more successful.
Okay, but they're not like the Africanized bees where they're going to attack you.
Not at all.
Okay, good.
You're not going to get bit by anything in a worm bin. Even if you were to get ants, they would not harm the worms. Of course, you could get stung.
Yeah.
So if you end up with ants because you overfed them fruit and they like the sugar,
Yes.
and the ants show up,
Yes.
then you could either use a ant bait, such as roach away, which is boric acid,
Yes.
or you can use diatomaceous earth.
Oh, and you would just put the diatomaceous earth in, or
You
that
can
would-
sprinkle it, and it does not harm the worms.
Oh, okay.
If you're going to use boric acid, then you would put that in a mayonnaise lid and put it right on top of the bedding, and then put your lid back on.
Okay.
Now you see a lot of seeds.
Yes.
And what is wonderful about a worm bin is it is a fabulous place to germinate seeds.
Okay.
So if you want to germinate seeds, you want to put them on the sides so that when you feed the worms, you're not disturbing your newly rooted seeds.
Okay.
Now these are all pumpkin seeds. And the worms are going to eat this and the other critters. I fed them pumpkins because of all the excess pumpkins from Halloween and Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And they love pumpkins, they love watermelon, and they love cantaloupe.
Okay.
So that is, and then I also use a commercial feed, which is made by Purina, and I sprinkle it on top. It's basically like a chicken mash,
Okay.
but the reason I use it is because I have so many worms.
Yes.
A homeowner would never need to buy that.
Okay.
Unless they just want to supplement it if they're going on vacation or something.
Mm-hmm.
They could leave some extra corn mash or cornmeal on top of their worm bin and throw in a little bit of extra paper.
Okay.
Now I want to show you how to make a worm bin for your home. So if you're a homeowner that wants your own worm bin, you can get a 33 gallon bin from anywhere, Walmart, the dollar store. You want it to be fairly sturdy because as the worm bin becomes more and more castings, it's going to be heavy. So if you're a one-person family and you barely ever cook, then an 18-gallon bin would be big enough.
Okay.
If you're someone that cooks most nights of the week, then you want to have a 30 or 33-gallon bin.
And how big is this one?
This is 30.
Okay.
So you want to start out with shredded paper. And most people have a shredder in their home. And so you want to use that shredded paper. I have plenty of paper if anybody needs extra. People collect it for me from work or whatever. They want to know, can you use newspaper? And absolutely you can use newspaper instead of shredded paper.
Okay.
You don't have to worry about the ink. It's made with soy these days, not lead, so it's not harmful to the worms. I also mix the shredded paper with moistened peat moss. And the best price on peat moss I have found is at Home Depot. I get a huge bin of peat moss. Excuse me. And this is 3 cubic feet. It only needs a little bit, and you soak it in some container, and you fill it up completely with water and the peat moss, and you want to soak it for 3 or 4 days. If you're in a hurry, then you can soak it faster than that. Now you smell a little bit of odor there. That shouldn't be there, but my husband was helping me, and he didn't realize the water had been sitting there for a few days, and he put me some new peat moss in, and so it has that smell. But if you soaked it 3 to 5 days, it's not going to have that smell. So we've got this pre-moistened peat moss, and it's very wet, and then we're just going to mix it. And this is where it's perfect to get kids in the neighborhood to help you. And they love to get in there and mix it all up. And there's nothing in there that's going to hurt them. If you're squeamish, you can wear gloves. But you want it to be really, really wet. And you're going to fill the bin completely with paper first, all the way up, and then add the peat moss. I like to do half and half. If you wanted to, you could do all paper. You would never even have to do the peat moss.
Oh, wow.
And it is Canadian peat moss. And this is like $11 at Home Depot. It cost about $18 at the garden stores. So don't go there.
Right.
If you decide you want worms, I teach people, I tell them to bring their bin, and I provide the bedding for them so that when they leave with their worm bin, it is the right consistency of wetness.
Okay.
The one thing people do wrong is they keep their worm bin too dry. Worms need moisture to breathe. So your worm bin bedding has to be damp. You want it to be the consistency of a wet sponge. Okay? And then you're not going to use the lid to the bin, you're going to use cardboard.
Okay.
And you're going to put the cardboard just inside the bedding on top just to keep it dark and damp. You need to keep this in some form of shade. A lanai is perfect. Just make sure that it never gets direct sunlight or you're going to bake your worms. People want to keep it outside. That's not a good idea because birds are going to find it, raccoons are going to find it, and rain is going to fill your bin. A lot of people put holes in their bin. I don't do that anymore. That was for aeration, and you just don't need that. They're getting plenty of air, and you're not going to grow mold because you're not using the cover, you're using this. And about once a week, you're going to come along and you're going to squeeze your bedding. And we're not going to take the time to make this whole bin right now.
Okay.
But you're going to squeeze your bedding about once a week.
Okay.
And you want to be able to elicit about 5 to 10 drops of moisture.
Okay.
Okay?
And this is before you put the worms in, or
This is if we were making this bin today completely, we would have it completely mixed up before we ever add the worms.
Okay.
Okay? So then people say, how many worms do I need? If you cook every day, then you want about a pound of worms. But you're never going to need to buy worms again because they're going to reproduce. And as long as you keep them fed and keep them in the right environment, you're never going to have to buy worms again.
Okay. And in terms of pricing, like you're making this for a customer, how much would you charge to make someone a worm bin?
If it included the bin, it would be $37.
Okay, that's very economical.
Yes.
I mean, you're talking about you're providing nutrients for your yard indefinitely for that price. So that's
yes.
amazing compared to like buying fertilizer.
Absolutely.
And
Okay, so this is how I separate the worms. If somebody calls and says they want to buy a pound of worms, I go in the worm bin and I just literally pick up mounds of worms and existing bedding, because I want to be able to give you bedding that is already full of billions of organisms. So when you add the worms and the bedding, your bin is good to go. It's already full of organisms. But first, I am a big recycler. Some people would say I'm a hoarder, but actually it doesn't make sense to buy things when you can reuse. So my friends keep coffee containers for me. So these worms have been in here about an hour and a half. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to grab them by the handful, and then I'm going to put them in the coffee can. And I already know what this coffee can weighs. So I've got the worms, and I'm going to, it's usually about 5 great big handfuls. 200 to 400 worms, depending upon the size. You're going to get different size worms, and then they're going to be weighed, and you're going to get a pound of worms. And then I will put the bedding in with the worms so that you've got that established bedding already. So I've got a customer coming later, and so that's why these bins are sitting here under the light so that I can weigh the worms and have it ready for her. Now, if you're going to separate your worms from your castings in about 4 months, this is also a good way to do that.
okay, so this is how you would separate your own castings to apply to your garden.
Yes.
And how often do you say?
It depends. If you start out with half a pound of worms, then you're probably going to have castings in 5 to 6 months.
Okay.
If you start out with a pound, then you're going to have castings in 3 to 4 months. And you know they're castings and they're ready when you can pick up, and it's like coffee. Okay. And we'll go out to one of the existing bins, and I will show you what castings look like after they're ready and after they have been harvested. And me, as a commercial worm grower, I use a commercial sifter. So my husband made me this. There's many types you can buy on the market, but my
this is
husband
really
made
cool.
this. Yeah. So all you do is take some of your castings, and it's on hardware cloth, which if you're familiar with sifting for gold up in North Carolina, it's the same principle. And then he used a reciprocating saw so that this goes back and forth. And then you end up with a better quality product. And then this is still a good product, but it's got a little bit of undigested food in it, so I will use this in my own yard. Okay? And then for the average homeowner, if it's a beautiful day outside like today, you don't have to do it inside underneath the lamp. You can take it outside, and if you'll follow me, I'll show you this. So if it's a beautiful day and you'd like to go outside and harvest your worms, it's a great way to get the kids involved. And you would just take your worms out of your worm bin with the bedding and just put it on top of a workstation. This is just a cardboard table. And then this is about the amount of worms and worm castings you want. And you can see the worms are here. And I would do this a little bit in a sunnier area. Right now we're shaded, but if it's a beautiful day and it's in the 70s and 80s and the sun is shining, then you're going to have the worms go down, they're going to hit the plastic and they're going to stop, and you're going to scoop the castings off the top. And then the worms are going to be at the bottom, and you're going to take your worms and you're going to put them in a brand new bin that you already have ready. Now I did see a couple of eggs in here. It's not quite cool enough for a massive amount of eggs. Well, they disappeared on me. But you can see the roly-polies and that type of thing. So that's another option of how to separate your worms from your worm castings.
And now if you don't want to go through this whole process, if you're not a do-it-yourselfer, you can also purchase them already sifted from you.
Absolutely. We sell the castings by a pound bag. Here's one of the cell bugs I was telling you about. Mm-hmm. That is called a pill bug or a roly-poly. Mm-hmm. But you can buy them from me. I sell them by 1 pound, 3 pounds, and 5 pounds. And then I have some customers who are have a larger piece of property and they will buy a 20-pound bag or a bucket. So this is another example of recycling. This is a bathtub. This would make a fabulous worm bin. So don't think that you have to go buy bins. If you're riding down the road and you see deep drawers or a bathtub or a washing machine tub, whatever, this is a fabulous worm bin. Now this one doesn't have worms in it, but what it does have is absolutely beautiful castings. Mm-hmm. And if you smell that and touch it, it just smells like wonderful, rich earth.
Yes, it does.
And literally billions and billions of the organisms are inside of there. Mm. And that's what you want for your yard.
Okay.
And as I said before, you can just put it around the plant. You don't even have to rake it in. Mm-hmm. You can water it in, or Mother Nature will water it in. Okay. And then the plant is going to use the contents of the castings as the plant needs it.
Okay. And then I have some questions on that. So I have a few questions. We inherited a property that was a rental property, so the land wasn't well taken care of. So I have a few plants here that have some issues. So this is a sugar apple that is in a pot, and she's not very happy.
Not happy at all. Something's eating on her, and then she's got some deficiencies, you can tell by the leaves. Mm-hmm. So you should get good results with your castings. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about burning with castings like you do with commercial fertilizer, mm-hmm. but you do want to be stingy with them to some extent. So a pot that size, I would use about a 1/4 cup.
Okay.
And then as you see the response of the plant, mm-hmm. you can either use less or more. Tomatoes and peppers are going to use a lot less castings mm-hmm. than trees.
And then how often for a tree would you do it?
Monthly.
Monthly, okay.
Until you start seeing some good response.
Okay.
And if you use your mulch mm-hmm. and your grass clippings mm-hmm. and the castings, then you're going to start creating your own web world. Mm-hmm. And eventually, you're not going to need to add castings to that section. Mm. It's already going to have its own little web world growing.
So really, it's like probiotics.
Absolutely.
For your body is what you're doing. So you're going to make it so that they have their own culture to do their own thing. And this is another plant that I forgot the name of. That is also the same thing. I could put some worm castings around it and see if it kind of gets more immunity.
Revives. And it looks like it's either burned mm-hmm. or something, a critter is eating on it. I can't tell.
Yeah. And then I have here a goji berry that has this powdery mildew kind of stuff on it.
And so we always recommend that you use the least amount of pesticides. So start out with making your own soap solution, and make sure you don't use Dawn or any kind of soap that has degreaser in it, because you will burn your leaves. This is one time that you can use the cheap dollar store soap in the container, and you can Google it. It's just a couple of tablespoons per quart of water, with maybe some added canola oil or vegetable oil, so that the soap will stick to the leaves.
Okay, wonderful. So apparently you can recycle everything. Old aquariums find it use. This looks like brewing equipment here.
So what this is for worm tea. And a lot of people want to know how to make worm tea. You can do it easily by getting a 5-gallon bucket, use 4 cups of castings, and then fill the bucket with water and put in a couple tablespoons of molasses. Get an aquarium bubbler and bubble the solution for a couple days. You'll start to see it bubble, and that means the organisms are eating each other, the bacteria and the fungus. And then after about 48 hours, you take that tea and you dilute it further with water, and then you spray it on the leaves of your trees and your plants, orchids, roses, etc. And it's a very nutritious plant food, and it's immediate. It's going to be a foliar feed that's faster than using the castings in the soil. Another way to make it is with an old aquarium. Same thing, a bubbler. And then for a commercial tea, you would use a larger container like this. And you, of course, would need more molasses, more water, more castings. But buyer beware. Don't buy tea or castings that you do not know the origin of, because if you think about it, the tea and the castings are full of organisms. If they are in an enclosed plastic container, you don't know how long they've been there, and you don't know how long it's been since they've had oxygen or moisture, and the organisms may be dead. So the moral of the story is know where they came from, or better yet, create them yourself by feeding them your kitchen scraps, which is virtually cost-free. So it's an easy way to compost, much easier than composting the old-fashioned way.
Yes, absolutely.
Florida is too hot or too cold or too wet or too dry, as we all well know. And you need moisture and heat for composting. With worm bins, the worms do all the work for you.
And no shoveling cow poop.
No shoveling, no turning, just feeding them your kitchen scraps. And I'm always available to answer questions. I have a website, FloridaNativePlantSeeds.com, and my number is there, my address, my contact information. And if you're interested in butterfly plants or seeds, native plants, native seeds, those are also on the website.
And we're going to take a look at that right now too. We're going to do a little walk
Okay.
in a little piece of your 10-acre garden.